All right, folks. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever the heck in the world you are. It is V, the Guerrilla Economist, back again with our main man of the hour who needs no introduction. We're talking about Veles, the Dark Raven of the Deep State. And, folks, there's a lot to cover, a lot to go on. And with that being said, without further ado, Veles, good morning. And I know the Rumble thing is not on yet. I have to go back in and fix that. So the Rumble stream, if you're listening, if you're waiting for Rumble, it will be on in about a few minutes. So sit tight. Veles, take it away, brother.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be, to all the ships at sea. My thanks to V, and glad to be back with all of you again today. We'll start with some appetizers. Bear with me just a moment while I move some things around on my screen. And as V said, for anybody who would prefer to listen to this on Rumble, it will be up in a bit, but we are up on YouTube. So hang on just a second. Adjusting things on my screen. Okay. So far, we've got 20 of you and growing. All righty. So a baseline for today's program should probably open every program with the following or something like it. And I kind of have once or twice. There's that meme out there that pops up periodically on Twitter or other chat platforms. It shows an astronaut standing on the moon and they're looking at the Earth. And then there's a variety of different text clouds next to him. And one of them has the astronaut with a little bubble saying, "You mean the Earth is run by elite pedophiles?" And behind him is another astronaut standing with a gun to their helmet and says, "Always has been." There's a bit of truth to that meme, or a lot of truth, including blackmail and pedophile activities more prominent than most of us could probably handle. There's also many powerful people so thoroughly compromised by the system, they should actually be pitied as much as blamed. It's a system who for centuries, literally, is blamed or is based on leveraging artificial scarcity on the human populace who in one form or another is in a form of servitude. You can also use the word slavery. You just don't see the chains. Two important considerations in what I just said. Internalizing the truth of that aspect of the world will set you free as it enables you to understand the mechanisms of enslavement and free yourself. Secondly, the battle at present in the global economy is about the nature of your ownership of your own labor. Not to get too crazy in my commentary, it's where the artificial intelligence topic may in fact be a means for your own freedom as much as surveillance. Let us recall when the internet became truly its own in the 1990s. There was a lot of good and bad with that fact, and education is the only way to make sure you're not taken advantage of. With artificial intelligence, positives are many, including using those tools to manage your investments, your professional skill development, running or improving a business, and similar. The many sides involved in the current global economic battle are not our friends. They have their own self-interests. One of the things we attempt to do on Rogue often is empower you to see that battle for what it is and how you can benefit. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis from my program last week. Let me offer some clarity on that segment from last week's program about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. There was a bit of input and commentary from a number of folks on this item, which I appreciate. I just wanted to clarify that my intention was to articulate how their separate works were two paths to the same place, that being a renewal in the Christian world after the bloodshed and lost hopes following World War I. It was in no way, shape, or form an attack on either author, nor a suggestion either of them was anti-Christian. Like any person of faith, they both had their struggles throughout their lives. Their written works were radically different from one another and offered forms of renewal of faith, but by different means of storytelling was my goal in that segment. Palmer Luckey shared previously the technology executive Palmer Luckey and his carefully crafted media campaign illuminate the volume that we're going to see about him in the days ahead. At the time, I jokingly said the guy's being positioned to take over for Elon Musk, either in the administration, the defense world, or similar. Given Elon Musk's recent statements about what role, if any, he's going to play at Tesla and similar, you'll notice a parallel media campaign, that being a variety of news stories popping up about Palmer again. Place your bets, place your bets. Falling out of the sky. We do not have the complete list of who perished in the plane crash in San Diego yesterday. We do know music agent Dave Shapiro was aboard, and I'll ask the unaskable, what relation does that have, if any, to the current ongoing P. Diddy court case? I'm sorry, in the prior 12 months, that's a lot of plane crashes. There was also other passengers on board who we do not know who they are yet, as well as a drummer of a band that was on board as well as the folks on the ground. Religion. Speaking of religion, we always need to be careful. For those of you who heard my program about the Human Interference Project, recall the cult of the glowing cat. By the way, I will be representing that program soon. It's both germane to our current situation as well as world history. Recently shared my surprise at a sudden surge on X, aka Twitter, of all things Orthodox Christianity. Everything from icons to readings, famous saints, and explanations of faith. We're one of the smaller Christian groups in the US, though, which is not the case in Eastern Europe or Greece, among others. So it's nice to get a little good press. However, I've been suspicious. Why now and why our community? Other than the fact we're a tight-knit group, and when motivated to act, we can move as a force to be reckoned with. Always in the back of my mind with religions or faith in the world is its utility to the world's elites. Said more bluntly, used by the world's elites to achieve their own ends. Worst case scenario, a single world religion. In the last 2 weeks, something very disturbing from my worldview has occurred. There's chatter in social media the Roman Catholic Pope wants to discuss the grand unification with the Orthodox faith. What am I talking about? There was once a unified Christian faith, including the two churches established by the Apostle Peter. Those would be Rome and Constantinople. As Orthodox believers are fond of pointing out, Constantinople was established before Rome. I say that because leaders in the Catholic Church have chastised Orthodox believers for years by saying we owe our allegiance to Rome because of Peter. The Grand Schism occurred in the year 1054 when the Roman Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople, after years of friction, excommunicated one another. This was the split between the two churches. An amusing historical item, what was the name of the Pope in 1054? It was Leo IX. So now the new Pope, named Leo, interestingly, has been meeting with the Constantinople Orthodox Patriarch to discuss reunification. Speaking entirely out of school, I didn't support reunification when it was Pope John Paul II, and I liked him. There must never be reunification of the churches, ever. It's not just philosophical or dogma of the faiths. I have feared for years any reunification, as to me it would be a sign of a global religion leveraged by the globalists. Keep you informed. Romania. My prayers for the people of Romania on their recent election. Not because one candidate won and I'm more politically aligned with the losing candidate. It's because Europe once again straight up overthrew a government just like they did in Ukraine during the Maidan. Why would Europe do that? Among other reasons, there's a long history between Romania and Russia, not the least of which their respective Orthodox churches. Please note the previous topic. My only solace is the strength of those churches and the Romanian people's ability to throw off yet another tyrant, just like they did with Ceausescu back in the 1980s. The losing side in the election is already bringing legal action and taking other measures to resist. Spain lost their cell phone service, their phone service on Tuesday of this week, who follows last week's power outage. This is causing flashbacks to the pushed narrative last year that HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, was causing all the aurora activity. It was not HAARP, it was the sun. I don't know if this is true where many of you live, but here in the Midwest, we can literally have a football field-sized rain cloud cruise over where you're standing on a sunny day. We jokingly call it a highly localized rain cloud. This is what Spain feels like. There are sources claiming it is the sun causing all the problems in Spain. How ironic. What happened to HAARP? This is a case where I would say I don't believe the sun is the cause. There are many reasons why. However, there are some people who feel our friends on the Levant are reminding Europe to not interfere with their goals. Otherwise, all of Europe will experience Spain's problems, and you know they have the means to accomplish that. Is that true? Who knows? Ironically, on Thursday, there were highly localized power outages in Switzerland, of all places. Head fake. Why would two senior administration officials very loudly and publicly state Jeff Epstein killed himself? Recall what I said about all things who occur publicly in view of the public, like private plane crashes and yachts sinking. This occurred during a significant TV interview and both officials at the same time. Did the public react? Yes, rather loudly, depending on the alternative source who covered the topic. Might the public have shrugged and done little in reaction? That also is true. Therefore, we can surmise it is an intentional act to create a reaction as well as test the public. What might the reaction be? A louder call for more disclosures about Epstein? Who was Epstein involved with? We'll pick any intelligence agency you like. However, if you're controlling the disclosures, you can keep your personal dirt out of those disclosures and blame someone you have a problem with. Recall what I just said about who may be behind Spain. The whole time you can tell other international elites, look, it's not our fault. Our public demanded more detail on that topic. They no longer believe the disinformation. Is that what's occurring? Who knows? But that's how I would do it if I were them, especially given quite a few threads that are ongoing this week, including the murder of the two Israeli ambassadorial staff in Washington, D.C. this week. Contempt. How much contempt do the world's elites have for us? The FDA announced this week any future COVID vaccines need to be more rigorously tested than the last time. They could have said just simply any future vaccines. They could have said a class of vaccines. But no, they spoke to existing vaccines for a single disease who has a lot of emotion connected to it. They also did it publicly. A clear example of how far removed they are from the average person. There's more, though. On Wednesday, the FDA ordered Pfizer and Moderna to update the warning labels on their COVID mRNA vaccines to include risks of heart-related injuries affecting teenage boys and men. Those statements were not on the alternative news sites alone. It was also on places like CBS News and the front page of my local newspaper. What do you think the public's reaction would have been if that was publicly stated during the coup? Maybe this is why two key administration officials were interviewed stating Jeff Epstein killed himself, which he didn't. But I distract. Contempt in blue cities. Speaking of contempt, I thought this next item was made up until researching and finding, nope, totally true. In St. Louis recently, as dangerous tornadoes approached the city, the tornado sirens did not sound. Difficult to tell if it can be proven to be a direct cause, but 5 people died in those storms. Why didn't the sirens go off? The Emergency Management Agency Commissioner, Sarah Russell, and her staff were attending a training workshop that day. There was no one in the Emergency Management Department office where, wait for it, the button is located to turn on the sirens. They did try to contact the St. Louis Fire Department from their training location to see if maybe they could turn on the sirens. Upon review of planning documents, who were also written by Sarah Russell, the guidance for activating the sirens has been described as vague. She's on paid leave while the mayor of St. Louis launches an investigation. Golden, Pennsylvania. Following up from my last update, I checked the Pacer Court website relating to the FBI being sued by the treasure hunters known as finders keepers. The most recent posting is that the FBI says they can only review 500 pages a month of the 1,700 pages of content the agency believes are germane to the case. Therefore, they cannot report back to the court until July or August. The defendant, finders keepers, says, look, it's been 7 years on the Freedom of Information Act request, 3 years on the court case, and this is nonsense, and the FBI doesn't need all this time, at least in their statement to the judge. Further, the FBI is reviewing its own paperwork and could simply report to the court late this summer, well, we didn't find anything. The next step now is the judge has to decide whether to wait until this summer or pursue another action against the FBI. Not to worry, I'll keep you updated. Bridge impacts. You all caught the symbolism and the ritual in the crash of the sailing vessel from Mexico in New York a week or so ago? Of course you did. Nuclear power. After at least a year of saying this on Rogue, the nuclear balloon has gone up. Supposedly, beginning today, the administration is going to begin signing various executive orders to encourage nuclear power in the United States. Now the avalanche begins as the appropriate elites got into place first. Noting that topic, small modular reactors, or SMRs. My thanks to N.A. Knight, as always. He's been quite vigorous on Discord and keeping us up to date on all things nuclear. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, has submitted a permit to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, for the construction of a General Electric Vernova Hitachi nuclear energy SMR near Oak Ridge. That's a lot in one sentence. Rogue has been covering this since last year and the spikes in all things small nuclear reactors. A lot of people feel they can make a lot of money from building these, including Bill Gates. The desire is to build up to 4 of the SMRs at the site in Tennessee, which is ironic because it's in Oak Ridge, and if you know your nuclear bomb history, you know why that matters. Electro trucks in California. This news item hot off the presses from Power Progress magazine. That publication focuses on things in the diesel engine, truck, and backup power industry, among other areas. California's CARB organization, known as the California Air Resources Board, I guess today's show is the day for acronyms, has been forced to drop their requirement for Class 8 and similar over-the-road trucks to be electric by 2035. California was being sued, rather ironically, by Nebraska, along with the California Trucking Association and others to drop that requirement. The rule was not just for in-state trucking firms in California, but any truck that crossed state lines, regardless of where it came from or who owned it. I get the feeling California is not going to fight this. Also this week, the U.S. government has said, after years of CARB determining by default air cleanliness rules, they will no longer have that power. That's kind of a big item, by the way, folks, because when I worked in the auto industry and the aftermarket parts industry, I can tell you from the mountaintop that for many years, whatever CARB came up with, even if it was so California specific, it just had no relevancy to other U.S. states. 9 times out of 10, the government would just shrug and say, well, it's CARB, we're going to go along with it. So for the federal government to say, hey, we're no longer just going to default to whatever CARB says is pretty huge. Final appetizer, shower gun. I think I did bring this one up a while back, but it's a good one. In the state of Ohio back in 2019, a guy had his home broken into several times. Neither he nor local police could find the burglar or stop further burglaries. So as a precaution, the guy became so safety conscious that he bought a gun holder that was waterproof and put it in his shower. The next time he found himself being robbed, what you know, he was in the shower. So he came out of the shower shooting, much to the surprise of the burglar. Police caught the frightened burglar down the road. So the big courses for today's meal: power. My thanks as always to Cool Cat, my brother from another mother, among many of you in the audience who I speak with often and do in many cases provide me the content I use or help me form the content, for which I can't thank you enough. There was an interview with a musical artist named Chopper who worked with P. Diddy at one time. He was interviewed on a program on YouTube called Real Life Productions. That's REAL, capital LYFE, all one word. He said something in the interview that was powerfully precise. He said, when it comes to that industry in many high-profile areas in our world, and I quote, success does not come from working hard. It comes from being chosen, unquote. He went on to say, quote, you still need to have talent, and you better keep on producing for them, because if you don't, they're going to do you in, unquote. There's a lot of truth there. It's not to say working hard and smart doesn't matter. At the same time, per opening content for today's program, you need to understand the system. Here in the Midwest, I'm very aware that if I was to become financially and socially successful in certain areas of business, I'm going to need to sell my company or my clients. The people who hold influence will not want someone stepping into that world who is not one of them. Play your cards right and you can make a lot of money in those situations. You just repeatedly sell things to the elites and what they want every time they think you've become too big. However, you're going to need to sell what you built in the end. I've shared examples including high-ranking positions, the high-ranking position I was given when I was in Washington, D.C. that set everybody off. It set them off because when people looked into my background, I had not graduated from a military academy. I hadn't worked in Washington, D.C. for several decades. I hadn't been on some sort of classified mission in some godforsaken corner of the world. My family didn't come from great wealth, and the list goes on. I was, by their view, one of the worst forms of outliers there are. Equally, some of the connections I have in my life have also caused some problems, including the altercation I told you about at a defense conference I attended, where a few DC insiders started demanding of me to know how I knew certain people, because according to them, they knew everybody in Washington and they had no idea who the hell I was. To Chopper's comments, when it's government, entertainment, or anything where you and your image is in the public eye, they owned you before you ever rose to that level. Recall just this one example of the fact that Bill Clinton was compromised long before he was Arkansas's governor or president. They compromised him back when he was a Rhodes Scholar. And we know that that goes all the way back to Cecil Rhodes and further back. It's a pattern that's gone on for generations. The Diddy trial, we've seen this before. Continuing with this topic, some familiar jingles, my friends. Why do certain people connected with certain events receive book deal advances? Because the likelihood of a book will ever be written is low. It's a payoff, pure and simple. Why do powerful people gift money to universities and then expect that money to be spent by the school at businesses owned by the donor? Because it's laundering. In my time on this earth, I was crazy enough at times to believe I could practice law. Keyword, could, not want. Not until I knew what I know now at 50 would I probably make sense for me to be a lawyer before I passed the bar. One of the reasons why I thought that was the case was I had seen so many court situations where even as a layperson, bear with me, even as a layperson, I reacted to certain high-profile cases by inwardly saying to myself, you're bringing the wrong case. That's the wrong area of law to focus on in that high-profile case. It's no wonder you lost. Then long before the two-step of the attorneys in the Ghislaine-Maxwell case, I noticed a pattern. Because in that case, what happened was both the prosecutor and the defense attorneys in the Ghislaine-Maxwell case, they kept trying to make sure both sides kept trying to make sure certain evidence didn't get entered into the court record because everybody knew how dangerous and damaging that would be. They were both trying to figure out a way to just make that case go away. There were many court cases who exist solely to give the appearance of a prosecution, the appearance of resolving some big injustice out there, but nothing changes. This is why I have so much respect for our friend of the show, Bill. He and others like him I've met understand both in how to be effective in the law and what the legal system's really about. I'm not being sarcastic, I'm dead serious. It's why there's no statute of limitations on murder or fraud. The legal system considers them an affront to property and value in our legal and economic system. You don't need to like that, but it's why no one can tell you what to do with your kid, especially when changing their gender below the age of 18, because your children are literally your livestock under what the law says. So let's talk about the Diddy trial. Total disclosure, I have not watched every nuance of the Diddy case nor read all the transcripts or anything else. I've relied on various articles, interviews, commentaries to cross-check sources, information, and various other views about the case. The net, though, is this. What are the specific federal charges in the New York court he's accused of? He's been charged with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution across state lines. So what does that mean in dog years? It means that Sean Puff Diddy Combs is accused of running a criminal enterprise that used his music company to influence and sexually exploit and traffic women. He's accused of coercing them into participating in drug-fueled sex parties called freak-offs and controlling them through threats, intimidation, and promises of helping their career. Even more loosely said, sex and drug blackmail with the potential of reward, or essentially Hollywood since the 1920s. What has the case focused on? Sensationalism, sex parties. Yes, folks, they do happen and have been happening for hundreds of years. One woman's degree of manipulation by the guy, and he's a horrible person. From the perspective of evidence or testimony about the networks to transport people across state lines, racketeering, and related, so far, I just don't see it. Plus, we've also got a lot of young men involved in this story, too. There have been rumblings since this began by people saying he's not going to be convicted or convicted on very little. If this case keeps going the way it's going, and I'm not an attorney, and conducting testimony over the things of which he's not charged, then it's theater and only theater. That and exposure of a lot of things, but no convictions. We will see. It's a theme raised by many on many topics, my friends, and that concerns the real reason for the California high-speed rail. Why invent a new approach when the old ones work so well? The global elite is no different. So let's discuss what's really going on with the high-speed rail network in California. Prior to that, let me provide a little history, because it'll help. Long ago in the 1990s, I was working in the telecom industry, and I got a crash course in how did we get here. You see, even if you want to create a telecommunications company back in those days, you had a problem. And the problem was real estate, or said another way, quote unquote, right of way, a phrase that relates to what's going on in California right now relative to high-speed rail. The right of way meant exactly that. If you want to put a road down, a railroad track, a telegraph wire, fiber optic wires, copper cabling, whatever it might be, you have to have the legal right of way to lay that infrastructure down. In fact, when I was working in the telecom industry, in a lot of cases, we began by putting wireless transmitters on buildings in Boston, and then were reminded by attorneys that we had to take those down because there was a grandfathered in law in Boston that whoever owns the building has the legal right about what's placed on it when it comes to communications. In that era, when the law was written, it was to avoid a lot of telegraph wires crisscrossing Boston. And of course, the other thing was the building owners wanted a lot more money for putting those transmitters there. And of course, drilling into a building or laying new communications gear in Boston was insanely hard because every damn building in the city is on the historic registry. So during my time in that industry, I found out about was made to understand the history of two big players in the industry that's often forgotten. The first is Sprint Communications. Their name is a clue in the first three letters, SPR, because that stood for Southern Pacific Rail. If you look at the old Sprint logos, you might notice there's an old style locomotive cowcatcher in their logo. As they had the rights to the former railroad track that gave them the right of way to lay down communications infrastructure. The other firm that I think has been since purchased is one called Level 3. They were a mining company who had what? Right of way for communications infrastructure between their various mines, which cross state lines. In both cases, the core business may have disappeared or been reduced, yet they still have right of way for the land they still owned. So let's turn back to California, as there's a lot of dust and smoke, but little clarity around California's high-speed rail project. The high level is California embarked on a high-speed rail project to connect Los Angeles to San Francisco via a faster than traditional rail line. The project started, give or take, around 2008. It also would connect several other cities along the way. In classic Governor Gavin Newsom fashion, it's over budget, plagued with problems, and now has a new leader in charge of trying to get things right. Beyond the other sources I used for this story, I would point out I've got some folks on the ground in California who fed me data about this story to help confirm what I'm about to tell you. The most recent estimate is the project will be complete in 2045, which obviously was 10 years after when all trucks were supposed to be electric. A huge amount of California and U.S. federal government money has already been invested in this project. To twist the blade, recent media reports have said China completed a similar project in about a year. For all the anger, frustration, defense of the project, concerns about the need for it due to the environment and every other hot button issue, absolutely nothing about this project is as advertised. It's a classic confidence game by powerful families in California who are masters at this stuff. So let me explain. The Donald recently stated the U.S. federal government will cease providing funding for the project for the reasons I said a moment ago: over budget, delays, lack of effective leadership, etc. The public narrative on that is the prior administration, being of the same political party, supported it and funded it. The current administration of the opposing political party has defunded it. Nothing could be further from the truth. Again, this isn't about good or bad, it just is. The elites who back the Donald know what's really going on in California, so they cut off the money. What would be the first thing the rail project in California would logically need to do? Spend a lot of money digging and establishing the right of way for future track being laid. They even have a corporate entity to manage it called the California High Speed Rail Authority, or CHSRA. You see, though, the past is prologue in this situation. William Newsom, Gavin's father, was involved with J. Paul Getty of Getty Oil all the way back in the 1920s. There are a series of very nice Getty museums around the country thanks to all that oil money. William Newsom enabled Getty, beginning in the early 1920s, to purchase land in the Santa Fe Springs area who previously had been homes. The money from those oil wells established Getty's expansion into the Huntington Beach area near Los Angeles and the creation of Pacific Western Oil Company as the overall oil business grew. There are also many political moves by William Newsom and Getty and the California state government enabling little opposition from the State Land Commission to these purchases. Throughout the 1930s, and importantly the Depression years, extensive land acquisitions continued, especially because people were distressed due to the economy. The other thing all these land purchases and oil infrastructure expansions enabled was an integrated oil corporation rather than a series of independent entities, or what's known as wildcatters. Amusingly, in 1949, it was Getty's Wealth who sponsored the neutral zone between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. For you history fans, that piece of real estate was where Iraq in the early 1990s accused Kuwait of using sideways drilling to pull oil from the Iraqi oil fields at Ramallah. This was the little item 40 years later who led to the war with Iraq in 1991, but I digress. What's the old saying? It's all a rich man's game. The result of all these petroleum-producing region acquisitions and sweetheart deals from the California state government were pipelines running along the length of California. It was more than just oil, though. Remember, these acquisitions of land and incorporation into a large oil corporation provided miles and miles of right-of-way across the state. Who enabled what else besides the oil? Mining. We'll return to mining in a moment. By the early 1960s, the Gettys and Newsoms had tapped out most of those oil wells, and a lot of oil assets were sold for a sweet deal. The land, well, the oil company gave that back to California. Of course they did, because why pay taxes on it even if you have a nice deal with the state in the first place? What is included in the high-speed rail project currently underway? Pipelines. In a state who kept indicating they wanted to go all electric. Where are the rail lines planned to follow in their route from south to north across the state of California? You guessed it. The same former right-of-way the Gettys and Newsom's father had decades ago. Except this time it's being bought back with state and federal money at a premium. Pity folks in California have not performed any investigation into this. There was a time when the state had investigative reporters like Gary Webb working there, but we know what happened to him. This is not the only such example, by the way, of something like this little economic deal. It was the Pelosi family, yes, Nancy Pelosi, who with William Newsom received from the state of California Department of Natural Resources in 1960 a deal for the Squaw Valley State Park, an area who would be developed for the Olympics when it was held there, and the ski resort who operated for many years afterward. To be fair, though, we've seen examples like this in other states. It's just when it occurs in states like New York or California, it's so obvious you can see it from space. The irony is, based on what I'm hearing out of California, that the high-speed passenger rail line may never be built. Of course, that wasn't the point. But there are many natural resource discoveries, including rare earths, who can be mined along the same route. I wonder who will get paid for all those future rare earth minerals they're about to pull out. Sources of university funding. Good data from the Visual Capitalist website regarding where exactly the bigger portions of university funding are derived. More than half the American public college and university revenue comes from government sources. The federal government contributed $69 billion, who's roughly 18% of all revenue. State governments made up 28%. Tuition and fees are 21%, and private sources are 13%. Noting a prior rogue program losing federal funding and private funding for those schools whose anti-Semitism protections are being questioned adds up to 31% combined, federal and private. That is, after the fact, which Washington, D.C. leaders now knew before they pursued those strategies, and it further proves why they did. It's not just recent scandals who are not being explained. Just a reminder from the memory hole, we have details around World War I and World War II who to this day are still classified or hidden. While we continue to see if anything of value is part of the releases concerning Jeff Epstein, P. Diddy, JFK, RFK, and MLK, there are mountains of historical material who are still classified. Equally, whether in the past or contemporary events and scandals, we have to remember a very important rule. Why would any government report on itself, no matter how old the topic? Plus, you also need to distinguish between known documents and reports who are classified versus data you simply aren't allowed to have. This is true not just of the United States, but also Britain, France, and a few other countries, including Turkey, when it comes to events around the Armenian genocide. One of the explanations offered frequently, who we also hear raised about anything JFK related, is it may reveal intelligence tradecraft. Okay, but depending on the war, it's been more than 100 years if it's World War I. Until about 10 years ago, the CIA was still arguing they didn't need to declassify methods for invisible ink. I find that funny on several levels, not the least of which is they weren't even the CIA when invisible ink was developed for U.S. intelligence operations. Do you really mean to tell me spy agencies are so lazy they've not updated their tradecraft? I have a really hard time believing that. The other one used for years following World War I and II was, well, we cannot disclose anything who might benefit the Soviet Union. Okay, fine, but the Soviet Union ended in 1991. And after 34 years, what exactly is the problem? An oldie but a goodie was Rudolf Hess, kept in Spandau prison, conspicuously alive until he was about to be released around 1987 when he died. He died because he was conveniently murdered. Hess flew to England in the spring of 1941 and did so according to two main narratives. The first narrative being a misguided belief he could negotiate an end to hostilities with England. The second narrative was he was there to coordinate with sympathetic elements in British aristocracy who wanted Germany and Britain to rule Europe together. You can guess which of those theories I'm a fan. A former U.S. Army officer told me in the 1990s his U.S. security team said goodbye to Hess before their duty assignment was up. They said goodbye because Hess told them they would not be returning for their return shift to guard him. A little backstory is there were 3 security detachments guarding Rudolf Hess at any time at the prison. A British team, a U.S. team, a French team, and a Soviet team, each with an officer from those countries. Hess flat out told the Americans he knew the Russians would kill him on orders of the British. A deal had been struck between the two governments as both already knew the Soviet Union was soon to collapse. Any release of Hess would be dangerous given what he knew about many things, not the least of which was British aristocratic families sympathetic to the Nazis. For any of you who saw various TV shows like The Crown, you may recall how those programs dealt with the revelations about the abdication of Britain's King Edward VIII, that being he was forced from office because of his Nazi sympathies. Worse still, in the Crown series was Queen Elizabeth being debriefed on letters captured at the end of the war between Edward and Nazi leaders. Letters where he encouraged the bombing of civilian, not military targets in England to force a British surrender, the outcome of which was to enable his return as king. You students of history may recall there was a sudden shift in German bombing campaigns from military to civilian targets. Want to know the strange part? If the Germans had continued to bomb only military targets and airfields, Britain might have actually fallen. This is only a small subset of history and potential revelations, and that's just Rudolf Hess. God only knows how far down the rabbit hole goes. Anything the English are still classifying is immediately going to elicit one of 2 reactions from me. They're not talking about it because it involves the London Corporation, British elites, or both. We've had some recent disclosures of massive magnitude coming out of Switzerland the last 2 months, namely more transparency around money flowing from Germany into Switzerland during World War II and where that money is today. The timing certainly has my attention, as everyone involved could have stayed quiet, yet now for some reason we're talking about it. There are countless items from World War I, more than World War II, I certainly want disclosed, especially around banking transfers prior to and during the conflict, who raise a lot of questions. That and diplomatic communications at the time as well. Not to put too fine a point on it, but a number of countries from that era no longer exist, such as Imperial Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, among others. The following is a public domain item. To this day, there are still records and files from World War I alone who are restricted or classified by Britain, the United States, France, Germany. Amusingly, Russian Imperial Archive records that the Soviets wouldn't release, and Soviet files that the current Russian government won't release, and Turkey. Fascinating military news. During the most recent military engagement between India and Pakistan, something unexpected occurred. Please also keep in mind the following, and this is public knowledge. The United States provides India with much, but not all of its military hardware. Russia also provides them a lot of equipment as well. Pakistan receives a lot of their equipment from China, plus a variety of other suppliers. Said even more bluntly, pretty much everyone sells everything to these 2 countries. It reminds me of what occurred during the 10-year war between Iraq and Iran, where similar parallels were at play. With India and Pakistan, you can literally have Chinese aircraft on the Pakistani side, with French radars and God knows whose missiles going against Russian aircraft on the Indian side, with American missiles and potentially Israeli-made ground radar stations. When there's fighting between the two countries, everyone who sells arms on this planet is watching closely. Yes, I'll say it out loud. Sadly, it's the world's biggest armaments laboratory in both equipment and tactics. It's the latter item, tactics, who demonstrated something interesting. Bear with me just a moment. A group of Pakistani and Indian fighter planes moved toward one another near the border for air-to-air combat. Without delving too deeply into the details, when it comes to radar, you can have a general idea an aircraft is present, but not a lot of detail. It depends on the radar system you're using. Certainly not the kind of detail you need to establish a radar lock a missile can use to home in on its target, or even which target you're firing on. During the engagement, the Indian fighters suddenly found themselves taking fire from air-to-air missiles and couldn't understand what was occurring. Depending on the source of information, India lost some fighter planes. So what's the backstory? It was a good use of tactics. The Pakistanis were flying Chinese fighters whose radars are very well known and studied. The aircraft can only scan 2/3 as far as the Indian fighter planes. On paper, it means the Indian fighters could detect the Pakistani fighters miles in advance, take time to select the missile option, and fire before Pakistan's fighters could even get a solid lock. Further, ground control radars on the Pakistani side of the border were not lighting up the Indian fighters either. Again, it meant the Indian fighter planes were only known to be where they were in general terms because no one had locked onto them. This lulled the Indian pilots and their ground controllers into a false sense of security. Therefore, what tactic did Pakistan use? Hiding in the radar signatures of the Pakistani fighters were, depending on reports, 2 to 3 aircraft with much longer range radar. They were flying close enough, depending on the radar being used, it would only appear as a single aircraft rather than 2 on the opposing side's radar systems. At the appropriate time, the aircraft with the longer range radars locked onto the Indian fighters, fed that information to the main Pakistani fighter group, who then used the data to direct their missiles. The missile's range was not the issue, but the onboard radar systems of the Chinese-built fighters was the limitation. Not to be indelicate, these types of air-to-air tactics have not been much of an issue in the conflict in Ukraine. Both of the air forces in that conflict have avoided one another for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the entire battle space is filled with overlapping radar and missile batteries. It's why both sides have relied so heavily on drones. As a result, this recent engagement between India and Pakistan is going to provide a lot of military planners a lot to think about. My gut feeling is Pakistan was carefully practicing this maneuver to spring it on India when the time was right. Likewise, things on the ground did not work out well for Pakistan versus this air-to-air combat success. Neither country wanted this to get out of control, and the U.S. could act as mediator, and this chapter was ended. This tactic of using one aircraft's advantages to support another aircraft is not new. There are plenty of examples from Vietnam to the Falklands War in particular. Equally, hiding one aircraft inside the signature of another aircraft has extensive history, whether special operations missions or even drug cartels using it to sneak in cargo planes. When two militaries have relative parity in weapons, training, and related assets, is when effort is placed into creative tactics. It's like a trick play in football and begs the question how many such plays you have available and how often you can use it until the other side finds a way to defeat it. My final comment on this event is military planners globally will study all the details around this engagement, equally to discover if there are other things who occurred during that air-to-air engagement no one is publicly aware. Preparedness. In the spring of 2024, a tabletop exercise was held with John Hopkins Applied Physics Lab in Maryland and FEMA. They were running a simulation of how the U.S. would perform in a major solar event. The results of the tabletop have been published, and the results were not positive. The tabletop lasted for 2 days, it was a good amount of time in my book, and simulated several coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, toward the Earth. One of the first takeaways was satellites who can properly predict the impact of such events are few to none. You may visually observe a CME, and you have roughly 2 to 3 days before they arrive. Without the right kind of satellites, predicting the impact when they arrive is hard. The other outcome was once that energy strikes the atmosphere, and this is well known, it causes satellites' orbits to change and disrupt their ability to operate. Lastly, it was felt proper planning and coordination among disaster organizations was not as good as it should be. Said more bluntly, the simulation demonstrated individual emergency operations centers attempting to manage the problem at a regional or local level will be easily overwhelmed. Some Veles inputs on this story and topic. First, some of you may be aware there are rumors FEMA may be completely shut down as an agency. Being transparent, I spent many years working with FEMA as a consultant and again in my current emergency management work. That said, they certainly have their problems like any agency, and there's a lot wrong down there, or at least there was the last time I was there. At the same time, they're the only agency, much less organization, whose emergency training courses are uniformly taken seriously by a wide variety of response organizations. And by that, I mean both other federal agencies, fire departments across the United States, state agencies, universities, list goes on. In fact, I've passed several FEMA courses myself. Shutting down FEMA does not solve a variety of problems other than money spent. Further, mentioned on Rogue previously, a lot of former Red Cross responsibilities were literally dumped on FEMA in the early 2000s. You can get away with that when the Red Cross is as corrupt as they are. Equally, dumping FEMA responsibilities on U.S. states is not the answer either. Some U.S. states are pretty good because they have the tax base and the history when it comes to various forms of disasters. My other takeaway is this. It was the FBI's InfraGard organization, among others, where I have attended briefings about upgrading the U.S. power grid to be more survivable. Let me be clear on that point, as that does not require uniting the entire grid under a single model versus its current fragmented structure. We want the fragmented structure. The cost, depending on the source, ranges between $4 to $10 billion. That's it. $4 to $10 billion, and we can vastly improve the survivability of the U.S. power grid. Further, there are a multitude of good studies who've proven that the approaches are known, they've been tested, and proven that they would work. So why haven't we done it? The usual problems. Easier to keep demanding money for various pet projects when you can keep pointing to the problem but never fix it. Once the problem is resolved, you can no longer capitalize on it. The second item being, if the public truly knew for that kind of money we could improve the U.S. power grid, they would want to know why for decades nothing's been done to fix it. Last point on the hardening topic, would it fix everything? Well, absolutely not. It's a function of degree. For 4 to 10 billion, though, it would be vastly more survivable than it is today. And the big one, restoration of service would be vastly improved in the amount of time it would take. Imagine what you can get for 20 billion. In praise of our overlords, from a prior program was my story about the Air Force Intelligence graduate program I was in. We had an avowed Marxist professor from Jamaica who was a professor in that program. Why was a Marxist professor in the program? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. He wasn't half bad, and he did have his moments, one of which was the famous statement about the world's hegemonic leaders. One could almost believe he was referencing the London Corporation, and London did come up quite a bit in his lectures, something I didn't understand at the time, but I certainly do now. He said as a Jamaican Marxist, he was opposed to any form of hegemonic power, among many reasons, but the most being what they had done to his community back in Jamaica. However, if we consider Pax Romana, Pax Gallia, the French peace after Napoleon, Pax Britannica, and Pax Americana, we've never lived the last 1,000 years without a hegemonic power. He leaned back and looked out the window and prophetically said, what would we do without the structure provided by all-encompassing hegemonic powers? Would we even know how to manage our societies? That's no longer an academic pondering because we're living through it right now. Though I simply can't imagine a power shift this monumental and the world's elites, like gods of the ancient world, decide to leave us to our own path. Are the implants still coming? Well, check your cell phone. Someone will still be in charge, though, or already is. Why is it incremental? In my early days with Rogue, and since then, I've used a reference you all remember. The Saturday Night Live comedy routine of the guy sitting next to the angel, and the guy has just died, and he asks the angel, what's the most incredible thing there is? The angel says, you can't handle it. The guy says, oh, come on. And the angel says, no, you'd literally wink out of existence. It's just too much for you to handle. And the guy says, okay, what's the 1,000th most incredible thing there is? And the angel looks at him very seriously and says, professionally wrestling is actually real. And the guy goes, no way. And the angel says, I know. Now imagine what the number one thing would be. Loosely said, some information is so incredible, so mind-blowing, you have to climb the mountain one step at a time to acclimate yourself to the altitude. And it's true of the journey we at Rogue have been on with all of you for many years and continue to be. And that includes ourselves. So let's turn to the court case with P. Diddy as it continues to evolve. And noting my last segment, let's pause for a moment. These types of disclosures are a process. The same is true about the Promise software and other famous stories like that. The author and researcher Danny Casolaro was killed for investigating Promise because the system wasn't ready for the public to know about it yet. Plenty has come out since, including documentaries about Danny himself. Among many sensational items who have become public about the P. Diddy case in the court sessions is this. I'm not sure how many of you have read or saw. They have recordings from the musician Prince. Yes, indeed, discussing on tape what he knew about Diddy. In those recordings, Prince spoke to the fact when he realized what was going on in the music industry, he began documenting everything. Let me say that again. Prince stated on those tapes, he documented everything. Every meeting, every discussion, every rumor, everything. He also set up cameras in every part of his house. Now, not for Prince to create his own blackmail, as was done by everyone from Diddy to Epstein. Prince had cameras in every part of his house to avoid his being blackmailed. Think about that. Bear with me. You'd think I'd remember to turn my phone off. Across Hollywood, New York, Los Angeles, the music industry, I have no doubt there was a collective gasp from a lot of people. It's like the old trope of people listening to a will being read, and the person who wrote it says, you know all the times you thought I was asleep and you were talking about me? I wasn't asleep. Plus, where did Prince get the idea to do that? Logs and cameras with saved copies of security films. From his attorney, from other entertainers, who? I'm not saying Prince wasn't smart enough to think of it. As I often say on these programs, one of the reasons why companies and individuals hire consultants like me is we advise you on things like this, measures to protect yourself. Then the next big item. Where did the prosecution acquire Prince's recorded statements and potentially these recordings and logs of what he developed? Who did Prince entrust those to, and who else knows about it? And if Prince did it, who else is sitting on a trove of dead man switches to protect themselves? You could go crazy considering how far down this rabbit hole goes. Knowing Frank Sinatra, I'm sure he had films, but it's probably of him and Marilyn Monroe having sex. But back to P. Diddy. I don't recall how far back it occurred, but the comedian Andrew Schultz made a joke about Bad Boy Records, Diddy's record outfit. He also made other comments about Diddy during a comedy performance. Jokes about people trying to escape Diddy's house and then they hear the Bad Boy logo. Schultz in the routine implies the person, regardless of gender, knows they're about to be raped. He then moves on to the rest of his routine. The audience laughed, but probably didn't consider the joke too deeply. Cat Williams, long before he went nuclear of late talking about what he knew on this topic, slipped into his comedy routine famous African-American men having gay sex at Diddy's parties. Then he moves on to other content. The same outcome of people who laugh and move on, because you can't handle the whole thing in one sitting. So in the interim, professional wrestling is real. We've seen this pattern before. Recall the Family Guy animated TV program where Stewie Griffin ran naked through a shopping mall yelling, "Help, I've escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement." At the same time, people laughed and probably thought, what an odd reference. Then recall the timing of how they handled Bill Cosby. A comedian at a comedy club made a statement about Cosby, and the audience got angry. Then following that, there was an interview or another comedian did something similar following that first comedian making that statement. People then started slowly asking, wait a minute, what is this all about? Then the big one, the famous Saturday Night Live episode where they did a piece on the show alluding to those accusations. Within 48 to 72 hours, the ceiling caved in and the charges started coming down on Cosby, and he was in court. The other one is Paul Mooney, the former joke writer for Richard Pryor. During one of his stand-up routines, by the way, good luck finding that, he brought up what went south between Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah. He joked about Whoopi, who saw or became aware of something that scared her to her core, and she ran from Oprah, and the two haven't been together since. Mooney's accusation was it was the practices of boule, a form of voodoo who involves burning incense or related. Unlike the other examples I cited, that was the last time anyone heard anything further on that story. To oversimplify, whether it's Epstein or Diddy or even John Benet Ramsey or a host of societal realities, it's not just the soundbite. It's a progression of realizations. Did he had these crazy parties? Okay, they were crazy parties with drugs. Okay, fine. Crazy parties with drugs and sex. Okay, look, it was downright orgies. Okay, I don't think you understand, man. Dozens of people all having sex at the same time. This is no TV show, America. This is real. Okay, fine. The sex wasn't always consensual, and kids were involved. The average person going through each of those steps is going to struggle the higher up the mountain you go. It's a bit ironic to me that people have an easier time imagining 50 Hollywood celebrities and music industry people all writhing around on the floor in a cocaine-fueled orgy than what really happened with Jeff Epstein. Well, Veles, what do you mean? If child rape is taking place in Hollywood, why does that not register with Epstein? Remember what they always say in the press. Well, there were underage girls. That's a child. It's been conclusively proven government officials, industry executives, private financial leaders, scientists, and a host of other high-profile people were at those Epstein gatherings or parties. Debauchery so bad and so at scale, they couldn't do it in Miami or New York. They had to go to the Caribbean. Let me boil that down a bit. Our elected government leaders were involved in these sex orgies in the Caribbean for years. Whether you can consciously bring yourself to internalize it, those things did happen, and you know they did. Never mind some rather earth-shattering, as jaded as we are, statements by both the FDA and congressional hearings this week about the coof shots. So now consider the meaning behind strange ceremonies at the Olympics or the CERN Super Collider. It's also why the massive changes in the global economy must take place incrementally, and half of the real meaning behind those things that we see is still hidden. The host of the Middle Nation programs on YouTube has a fascinating way of describing this process, among many such ways of attempting to explain it. He calls it psychological decolonization. If you think about that for a moment, you'll pick up how deep a statement like that really is. What happens when they turn off the matrix in your mind, folks? Or you do it for yourself. So watch your footing as we continue to climb the mountain and have faith. God's vengeance is coming. With that, V, I yield the floor.
Great show, Brian. Great show. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just get myself back in here. Okay. Yeah, great show as always, folks. And folks, as I tell everybody with every single Veles show, go back, listen to it again, take your notes, because this was a data dump, an intelligence debrief that was par excellence, typical of Veles. And I want to thank you, Veles, for coming on. And yeah, man, it's a couple of things that was, I had a lot of things going on in the background, so I was muting myself and running back and forth. I had some workers in the house. One of the things I'll tell you, that whole Pakistan thing, they used a small plane that was acting as an AWACS, right? And the funny thing also is that they just gotten, like literally 2 weeks, 3 weeks before this whole entire conflict kicked off, a fresh order of the updated Chinese FL-15 missiles, which are a more advanced version of the AIM-120 AMRAAM, right? It has greater range. But the problem was the JF-17 fighters that the Pakistani Air Force was using, like you said, Veles, didn't have the radar range to start shooting down Indian aircraft in Indian airspace. And but those AWACS were a game changer. Completely caught the Indian Air Force by surprise, man. Completely. And here's the funny thing. That's a kicker out of it. Because of the poor performance of the Rafale, the French aircraft that the Indians were flying, Indonesia just canceled a multi-billion-dollar French order with the Rafale.
Yes. Yes, I just saw that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And folks, we've covered it here on Rogue before, the famous Libya and Turkey shoot back in whenever that was, where Europe ran out of arms and the United States had to paint our planes to look like they were from Italy or Germany. There was an arms show going on at the time. I want to say in Paris. It doesn't really matter. It was somewhere. And for years, American arms manufacturers always have on their little placards and things, their sales literature, their demos at these arms shows, battle tested. And it used to drive the Europeans nuts because they wanted battle tested. They just couldn't get battle tested. So after Libya, I use the word joke loosely. The joke in the arms industry is that all the European defense manufacturers quickly went out and redid all of their posters and things to add in the language, in whatever country they were in, battle tested. And so it's a sad statement on ourselves as a species, but it's like, yeah, this engagement between Pakistan and India, both on the ground and in the air, taught a lot of different countries and a lot of different arms people, like I said, tactics or weapon systems, what worked, what didn't. Because as the old saying goes, whatever your plans are, the minute the shooting starts, you can throw that right over your shoulder. Oh, yeah. So yeah, a whole bunch of people are now losing a lot of money. And the last thing France needs to hear in these uncertain times is, because let's admit it, outside of stealing everything they can out of Africa at every opportunity out of their mines, the French make a huge amount of money on arms. And the last thing they want to hear is a major defense contract just got canceled.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Very well said. Folks, thank you all for listening in. We will be back next week. Keep it locked and loaded right here. And guys, look, there's a lot of changes happening. New stuff is coming out. It's finally coming to fruition. So I'm excited to next month show that to all you guys. With that being said, we're over and out. Cheers.